Imagine standing on the most isolated, inhabited place on Earth. You are on Rapa Nui Easter Island, a tiny volcanic speck in the vast Pacific Ocean, so remote that the nearest inhabited land is over 1,200 miles away. It's perhaps the year 1400 AD, and you're living at the height of one of the most remarkable and mysterious civilizations humanity has ever created. Around you, across this small island, barely 64 square miles in size, stand hundreds upon hundreds of massive stone statues, moai their stern faces, gazing inland, their backs to the endless ocean. These are not mere sculptures. They are your ancestors, frozen in stone, watching over the living, connecting this tiny island to the realm of the gods and the dead. The wind is constant here, blowing across volcanic slopes covered in grass, carrying the smell of salt from the crashing waves that surround you on all sides. At night, the stars are overwhelming brilliant points of light in absolute darkness, unmarred by any light pollution, the same stars your ancestors navigated by when they first found this island centuries ago. The Milky Way spreads across the sky like a river of light, and you know every constellation, every star that marks the seasons, every celestial sign that guides planting and fishing and ritual. You people call this island Te Pito o Te Henua, the navel of the world, because it feels like the center of creation, a sacred place planted in the middle of an endless ocean. But you also know another truth. You are profoundly alone. Your ancestors voyaged here from somewhere in Polynesia, likely from the Marquesas Islands, perhaps as early as 700 AD or as late as 1200 AD, the exact date lost in oral tradition and the mists of deep time. They came in great double-hulled canoes, navigating by stars and swells and seabirds, carrying with them everything needed to establish life on this remote island: taro, sweet potatoes, chickens, rats, and most importantly, their knowledge, their gods, their culture. When your ancestors first arrived, the island was different. It was covered in palm forests, massive trees, similar to the Chilean wine palm, some growing up to 80 feet tall. There were land birds, seabirds, nesting in enormous colonies, rich fishing in the surrounding waters. The volcanic soil was fertile. Springs provided fresh water. It must have seemed like paradise to those first voyagers, a gift from the gods, a new homeland rising from the sea to welcome them. They established settlements, cleared land for farming, and began the process of creating a civilization in one of the most isolated places humans have ever permanently inhabited. The social structure that emerged was complex and hierarchical. Your society is organized into clans Marich, claiming descent from one of the original founding ancestors. These clans are not equal. Some are Ariki high-ranking, associated with the paramount chiefs who claim direct descent from the gods. Others are of lower status, but still free. At the bottom are the slaves, war captives or descendants of captives who do the hardest labor. Each clan controls certain territories on the island, certain fishing areas, certain quarries and resources. Competition between clans is intense, expressed through elaborate displays of wealth, status, and most importantly, through the construction of moai. The moai are everything. They are the physical embodiment of monospiritual power, and specifically of the mana of deceased ancestors. When a great chief dies, his clan commissions a moai to be carved to house his spirit, to serve as an eternal guardian and source of blessing for the living. The moai stand on platforms called which are themselves elaborate stone structures that also serve as burial sites. The combination of ahu and moai creates a sacred complex where the living commune with the dead, where offerings are made, where rituals connect the human world to the divine. You live in a hair, pianga, an elliptical house with a foundation of carefully fitted stones and a superstructure of wooden poles, covered with thatch made from totora reeds. The house is low, designed to withstand the constant wind. Its entrance small to conserve heat during cool nights. Inside, there's barely room to stand upright, but it's sufficient a place to sleep, to shelter from weather, to store possessions. Most of life is lived outside. working in the sweet potato fields that provide your primary food source, fishing from shore or from small reed boats, participating in clan activities and island-wide rituals. The island's landscape is dominated by 3 volcanic peaks. Rano Kau in the southwest, with its massive crater lake, is a sacred site associated with the Birdman cult, a ritual that will become increasingly important. Poik in the east is a distinct region controlled by specific clans. But the most important volcanic peak is Rano Raraku, the quarry where the moai are born. This is the source of the volcanic, tough compressed volcanic ash that is perfect for carving. It's soft enough to work with stone tools, yet durable enough to survive centuries. Almost all of the moai on the island come from this single quarry, carved directly from the living rock of the volcano itself. The process of creating a moai is extraordinary, requiring immense resources and coordinated labor. It begins when a clan decides to commission a statue, usually to honor a deceased chief. The clan must provide food for the carvers and workers, sweet potatoes, chickens, fish sustaining them throughout the long process. The carvers are specialists, members of a guild with knowledge passed down through generations. They understand the stone, know how to read its grain, can visualize the completed statue within the uncut rock. The carving begins with stone, tools basalt hand axes called, toki pounding and chipping away at the volcanic tuff. The moai is carved in a reclining position, still attached to the bedrock at its back. The carvers work from top to bottom, carefully shaping the head first with its distinctive features. The heavy brow, the long nose, the thin lips, the elongated ears that will later have ear ornaments inserted. The body is more abstract, less detailed than the face. Because the moai is all about the head, about the face that will watch over the clan's territory. The back is left relatively rough. It will never be seen once the moai is erected. The carving takes months, perhaps a year or more for the largest statues. Slowly, the moai emerges from the rock, taking on personality, presence, power. When the front and sides are complete, the most dangerous part begins. Detaching the moai from the bedrock that still supports its back. Workers carefully carve away the stone beneath, supporting the massive statue with rocks and wooden beams. If they make a mistake, if the stone fractures or the support fails, months of work is lost and the moai breaks. But when done successfully, the moai lies free on the slope of Rano Raraku, ready for the next phase, transport. Moving the moai is perhaps the greatest technical achievement of your civilization. These statues weigh tons. An average moai is about 13 feet tall and weighs around 14 tons. But many are larger, some much larger. The biggest moai ever, successfully erected, is over 30 feet tall and weighs approximately 82 tons. The unfinished moai still in the quarry include even larger specimens, including one colossus that would have been over 70 feet tall and weighed close to 270 tons if completed. How do you move such massive objects across the island using only human power? Ropes made from plant fibers, wooden sledges and stone tools. The exact method is debated by scholars in the distant future, but you know how it's done because you've participated in the work. The moais moved upright, walking across the landscape, rocking from side to side as teams of workers pull ropes attached to the head, guiding and tilting the statue forward while others steady it from behind. It requires extraordinary coordination, or even hundreds of people working together, responding to rhythmic chants that keep everyone synchronized. The moai slowly progresses across the island, sometimes traveling miles from the quarry to its destination, Aho. The journey is perilous. Sometimes moai fall and break, littering the landscape with failures. But when successful, the moai arrives at its platform, and must be erected tilted up from horizontal to vertical, then positioned precisely on the Aho. This is done by building a ramp of stones, slowly levering the statue up until it stands upright, then removing the ramp stone by stone until the moai stands on its platform, facing inland, watching over the clan's territory. But the moai is not yet complete. Once erected, the final and most sacred step occurs. The pukawa cylindrical top knot of red scoria stone is placed on the moai's head. This represents the hair tied in a top knot, the traditional hairstyle of high-ranking individuals. The pukao comes from a different quarry, punapo, and must be transported and lifted into place on top of the already standing moai. Finally, coral eyes with obsidian or red scoria pupils are inserted into the eye sockets, and the moai comes alive. With its eyes in place, it can see, can watch, can protect and bless its descendants. When completed, the moai is breathtaking. It stands on its platform, facing the village, its back to the sea. It is not looking outward for enemies, but inward, watching over the clan, channeling the mana of the ancestor it represents. The eyes are the key. Without eyes, the moai is powerful but dormant. With eyes, it becomes an active force, a conduit between the living and the dead, a guardian whose spiritual power protects the land and the people. You've grown up surrounded by these statues. They are as much part of your landscape as the volcanic peaks, the ocean, the sky. You know the stories of the ancestors they represent. You make offerings at the ahu where your own ancestors stand. You participate in rituals where the moai are honored, where the connection between living and dead is reaffirmed. The moai give your life meaning, connect you to a lineage stretching back to the first voyagers, assure you that when you die, you too might be honored with a statue, might stand eternal watch over future generations. This is Rapa Nui at its height, a small island supporting perhaps 15,000 people, organized into competing clans, building monuments that rival anything, created by ancient civilizations. Anywhere in the world, you have no metal, no written language, no contact with the outside world. You have only stone, wood, fiber, and human ingenuity. And from these simple materials, you've created something extraordinary, a landscape populated by ancestors in stone, a civilization that has conquered isolation and transformed a remote volcanic island into a sacred landscape. But standing here on this island at the end of the world, surrounded by moai, participating in rituals that seem eternal, working in fields that have fed your people for generations, you cannot know what we know from the vantage point of the future, that your civilization is approaching crisis, that the island that seems so permanent is on the brink of catastrophic collapse, that within a few generations everything will change in ways you cannot imagine. For now, the moai stand eternal, the rituals continue, and the world seems stable. For now, you are living in the golden age of Rapa Nui, and the future is unimaginable. The work never stops. Every day, teams of workers make their way to Ranoraku Quarry, where dozens of moai are in various stages of completion. Some are just rough outlines carved into the cliff face. Others are nearly finished, their features crisp and detailed, awaiting only the final separation from the bedrock. A few lie on the slopes below the quarry, ready for transport. And always, there is the sound of stone on stone, the rhythmic pounding of basalt tools against volcanic tuff, the sound of creation, the sound of ambition carved in rock. But you're beginning to notice something troubling. The palm forests that your grandparents spoke of in their stories are gone. The last palm tree on the island was cut down years ago, perhaps before you were even born. The massive trees that once covered portions of the island, that provided timber for moving moai, for building boats, for construction and firewood, have been completely harvested. Where forests once stood, there is now only grassland, swept by wind, with no trees to break its force. The loss of the forest has consequences that ripple through every aspect of life. Without large timber, you can no longer build the great double-hulled, voyaging canoes that your ancestors used to reach this island. The boats you have now are small, flimsy things made from totora reeds, bundled together sufficient for fishing, close to shore but unable to venture into the open ocean. You are trapped on this island. There will be no voyages to other lands, no contact with other Polynesian peoples, no escape if things go wrong. The ocean that surrounds you, once a highway connecting you to the wider Pacific world, has become an impassable barrier. The soil is eroding, without tree roots to hold it in place, without forest canopy to break the force of rain. The rich volcanic soil that made the island so productive is washing away. The sweet potato fields that feed the population require more work for less yield. You notice that harvests are smaller than they used to be. that it takes more effort to produce enough food. Hunger is more common, especially in the months before the harvest, when stored food runs low and the new crops aren't yet ready. The seabirds are disappearing. Once, they nested in enormous colonies all over the island, providing eggs and meat that supplemented the diet. But generations of harvesting, combined with the introduction of rats brought accidentally by your ancestors in their canoes, have devastated the bird populations. The rats eat the eggs, the humans eat the birds, and slowly the colonies have dwindled. Some species are gone entirely. The easy protein they once provided is no longer available. The obsidian tools that your people make sharp blades used for, everything from cutting to carving, are showing changes in design. They're becoming more like weapons. The mata, spear points made of obsidian, are being produced in increasing quantities. Why would people need so many weapons on a small island where everyone knows everyone else? The answer is uncomfortable. Conflict between clans is intensifying. The competition to build bigger and more impressive moai has become an obsession. Each clan tries to outdo its rivals, commissioning larger statues, building more elaborate. The amount of resources dedicated to moai. Construction is staggering food to feed the workers, wood to move the statues, stone tools that wear out and must be constantly replaced, labor diverted from farming and fishing. The investment is enormous, and it's all in service of prestige, of mana, of the desperate competition between clans for status and spiritual power. You see the signs everywhere? The unfinished moai lying in the quarry are getting larger. Your clan is planning a moai that will be taller than any yet erected, a statement of power and prestige that will prove your clan's superiority. But to create it will require mobilizing enormous resources, feeding hundreds of workers, organizing the transport of this massive statue across miles of rough terrain. And even if you succeed, you know the rival clan is planning something even more ambitious. This competitive escalation is consuming the island. More and more effort goes into moai, construction while less goes into sustainable food production. The population is still growing, but the island's carrying capacity its ability to support. People is declining as the environment degrades. It's a trap, and you can feel it even if you don't fully understand it. The harder you work, the more moai you build, the worse things seem to get. But stopping is unthinkable. The moai are your connection to the ancestors, the source of mana, the foundation of your entire worldview. To stop building them would be to abandon everything that gives life meaning. The political situation is becoming unstable. The paramount chief, the Araki Mo, who theoretically rules the entire island, is losing authority. Real power is fragmenting among the various clans, each jealously guarding its territory, its resources, its moai. Disputes over land boundaries, over fishing rights, over access to resources are becoming more frequent and more violent. The obsidian mata aren't just being made, they're being used. There are stories whispered in the darkness of your hair pianga that some clans have begun raiding others for food, that stores of sweet potatoes have been stolen, that violence has erupted. You've heard rumors of something even more disturbing, that in times of severe hunger, some people have resorted to cannibalism. You don't want to believe it, but the stories persist, and there are archaeological remains, bones with cut marks, bones that have been cooked that tell a story of desperation. Water is becoming a critical issue. The springs that provide fresh water are controlled by specific clans, and access to them is jealously guarded. During dry periods when water is scarce, tensions escalate. People who once cooperated now compete for this most basic resource. The social bonds that held the island community together are fraying under the pressure of resource scarcity. And still, the moai are being carved. At Ranuraraku, the quarry is littered with statues in various stages of completion. Some will never be finished. Some will never be moved from the quarry. They lie on the slopes like fallen giants, abandoned in mid-creation, when the resources to complete them ran out, or when social order broke down to the point that the coordinated labor required became impossible to organize. You participate in the work because what else can you do? This is your culture, your tradition, your connection to the divine. The moai represent everything your people have built, everything you believe in, even as the forests disappear, even as the soil erodes, even as hunger becomes more common and violence escalates. You continue to carve, continue to transport, continue to erect these stone giants, because to stop would be to admit that the system has failed, that the ancestors are not being honored, that the entire foundation of your society is crumbling. But the evidence is overwhelming. The island that seemed so abundant to your ancestors is being consumed. Every tree cut down, every bird harvested, every inch of soil eroded brings you closer to catastrophe. The population has outgrown the island's capacity to support it, especially as environmental degradation reduces productivity. The social system based on competitive moai construction is accelerating the decline, funneling resources into monuments, rather than into sustainable practices that might salvage the situation. Some of the elders speak of better times, when the forests still stood, when food was abundant, when the clans cooperated rather than competed so fiercely. But those times are gone, and they're not coming back. The environmental damage is largely irreversible with the technology available to you. The palms won't regrow quickly enough to matter. It would take decades or centuries to restore the forests, and you don't have that time. The soil that's washed into the ocean is gone. The bird species that are extinct are gone forever. What's happening on Rapa Nui is a case study in ecological collapse, though you have no framework to understand it in those terms. Your worldview is religious, cyclical, based on maintaining proper relationships with ancestors and gods. You don't think in terms of carrying capacity, sustainability, ecological limits. You think in terms of mana, tapu, sacred restrictions, and the favor of the gods. And within that framework, the solution to problems is more ritual, more offerings, more moai, exactly the behaviors that are making the situation worse. As you lie awake at night in your cramped hair pienga, listening to the wind that never stops, you might wonder why the ancestors aren't protecting you. Why the moai, whose mana should ensure prosperity, seem powerless to halt the decline. The answer, though you cannot know it, is that the moai never had supernatural power. They were symbols, artistic achievements, expressions of faith and culture. They could inspire, unify, give meaning to life, but they couldn't make trees grow or soil regenerate or fish multiply. They were stone, magnificently carved stone, but just stone. The crisis is building toward a breaking point. The island cannot sustain the current population given the degraded environment. The competitive moai construction is consuming resources needed for survival. The social fabric is tearing under the strain of scarcity and competition. Something has to give. The question is not whether. Collapse will come, but how it will unfold and what will remain when it's over. You cannot see the future, cannot know that within a few generations the moai will stop being built, that the ahu will be abandoned, that the statues themselves will be toppled in an orgy of destruction as the entire social and religious system collapses. You cannot know that, Rapa. Nui is approaching one of the most complete societal collapses in human history. A civilization reduced to a fraction of its former population, its environment devastated, its culture transformed beyond recognition. For now, you continue. You work in the fields, you participate in rituals, you contribute labor to moai projects. You honor the ancestors, make offerings, hope for better times. You are living through the final phase of classical Rapa Nui civilization, the last moments before everything changes. The moai stand on their platforms, faces stern, eyes gazing over the land. But they cannot save you. Nothing can save you from the consequences of your collective choices. The accumulated environmental damage, the social system that rewards monument building over sustainability. The island has been consumed by its own success, and the price is about to come due. The year is perhaps 1680, and the world you knew has ended. The great moai that once stood proudly on their watching over the land with coral eyes have been toppled. Nearly all of them lie face down in the dirt, deliberately pushed from their platforms, their necks broken, their pucao scattered. This destruction wasn't caused by a natural disaster or foreign invaders. It was done by your own people, clan against clan, in a paroxysm of violence and social collapse that has shattered the old order completely. You are old enough to remember when the last moai was erected, though you were just a child then. You remember the excitement, the clan gathering, the massive effort to move the statue from the quarry and raise it on the Yahoo. But you also remember that it was smaller than the old moai, that the resources to create something truly magnificent were no longer available, that even then the system was clearly failing. That was the last one. Since then, no new moai have been carved. The quarry at Rano Raraku sits silent, abandoned, littered with nearly 400 unfinished statues in various stages of completion, monuments to ambition that can never be realized. The population has collapsed. Where once perhaps 15,000 people lived on this island, now there are fewer than 2,000, maybe less. The decline came through multiple mechanisms. Starvation, as agricultural productivity fell and resources were exhausted. Warfare between increasingly desperate clans, competing for diminishing resources. Disease exacerbated by malnutrition and stress. Entire clans have been wiped out. Lineages that trace back to the first settlers have ended. The landscape is dotted with abandoned villages. Empty hair pianga, silent where no offerings are made. The social structure that revolved around moai, construction and ancestor worship has collapsed. Along with the statues, the paramount chiefs have lost their authority. The elaborate hierarchy of ariki and lesser ranks has broken down. What remains is a more fragmented, violent society where might increasingly makes right, where the respect once commanded by sacred lineage has been replaced by the hard power of warriors and their obsidian-tipped spears. The transformation is visible everywhere. The which were once sacred platforms approached with reverence, have been desecrated. Not only are the moai toppled, but the platforms themselves have been vandalized. Stones torn away, burial crypts exposed and looted. The sacred has become profane. The ancestors who were once honored are now despised, or perhaps blamed for the catastrophe that has befallen the island. Why else would people destroy the moai? These weren't just statues, but embodiments of ancestral mana, the physical manifestation of the connection between living and dead. Their destruction represents a complete rejection of the old religious and social order. A new cult has emerged to fill the void left by the collapse of the moai religion. This is the Birdman cult, centered on the dramatic, creator of Rano Kau and the tiny offshore islets where seabirds still nest. Each year, representatives from the surviving clans compete in a dangerous ritual. They must climb down the sheer cliff face of Rano Kau, swim through shark-infested waters to the islet of Rapa Nui, find the first egg laid by the city tern, and return with it intact. The winner becomes the Tangata Manu, the Birdman, for that year, conferring prestige and perhaps practical benefits on his clan. This new cult is different from the moai religion in crucial ways. It's more egalitarian. Any clan can potentially win through skill and courage rather than through inherited rank. It's less resource intensive. It requires no massive construction projects, no forest worth of timber, no hundreds of workers fed for months. It's more appropriate to the reduced circumstances of post-collapse, Rapa Nui, but it's also a shadow of the old religion, lacking the grandeur, the permanence, the cosmic significance of the moai cult. A bird's egg, however sacred, cannot compare to a 30-foot stone giant. The environment continues its degradation. The forests are long gone, not a single native tree remains on the entire island. The grassland that replaced, the forest supports some of the sweet potato, agriculture that feeds the reduced population, but productivity is far below what it was. The soil continues to erode, especially on slopes where nothing holds it in place. Some areas that were once farmed are now bare volcanic rock or eroded badlands, unsuitable for agriculture. The chickens that your ancestors brought have become increasingly important. With the seabirds largely gone, with fishing limited by the inability to build large boats, chickens provide the primary source of protein. They're so valuable that people build elaborate stone chicken houses hair moa to protect them from theft and from the rats that infest the island. The fact that you must build fortified, structures to protect chickens, tells you everything about the level of social breakdown and desperation. Warfare is endemic. The obsidian mata spear points are everywhere, scattered across the landscape where battles were fought. Some people live in fortified caves, seeking protection from raiders. Stories of cannibalism are no longer whispered rumors but acknowledged facts. In the archaeological record that future scholars will study, they'll find bones with cut marks, bones that were broken to extract marrow, bones that were cooked, evidence of the ultimate taboo broken in desperate times. But life continues because it always does. The survivors adapt to the new reality. Without forests, you build smaller structures. Without large boats, you fish from shore or from reed vessels. Without the social infrastructure for massive construction projects, you focus on simpler forms of art and ritual. The Rongorongo script, a unique writing system that may have developed during this period, appears on wooden tablets, though its exact meaning will be lost before anyone from outside the island can record it. You live in a landscape haunted by the past. Everywhere you look, there are reminders of what was lost. The moai lie fallen, some broken, slowly beginning to be buried by accumulated soil and debris. The quarry at Rano is frozen in time, statues abandoned mid-carving, tools left where they fell when the work stopped. The ahu stand empty, their sacred mana dissipated or corrupted. The island that was once covered in forest and dotted with thriving villages is now largely grassland, with a much smaller, struggling population, yet there's also a kind of equilibrium emerging. The population, drastically reduced, is no longer exceeding the island's carrying capacity. The sweet potatoes, chickens, and inshore, fish can support 2,000. People, even if they couldn't support 15,000. The environmental degradation has stabilized at a new, much lower level. There's nothing left to degrade. The forests won't come back, but at least they won't disappear further because they're already gone. The social system has simplified, but it's functional for the reduced circumstances. This is what collapse looks like from the inside. It's not a sudden apocalypse, but a long decline, punctuated by moments of acute crisis. It's the gradual abandonment of practices that no longer work. The slow transformation of culture as old meanings become irrelevant. It's the toppling of moai not in a single frenzy, but over years, as one clan and then another gives up on the old religion, as the statues come to symbolize failure rather than mana, as new generations see in them only the hubris of ancestors who consumed their inheritance. The psychological impact is profound. Your grandparents lived in a world that seemed stable, permanent, blessed by the ancestors. They believed in the power of the moai, in the structure of their society, in the continuation of traditions. You live in a world where all of that has proven false. The moai had no power to prevent catastrophe. The social structure collapsed. The traditions couldn't adapt fast enough to save the civilization. Everything your grandparents believed has been revealed as illusion, and you must somehow create meaning in a world stripped of its foundations. Future scholars will look at Rapa Nui as a cautionary tale, an example of what happens when a society overexploits its environment, when competitive display consumes resources needed for survival, when warning signs are ignored until it's too late. They'll study the pollen records showing the disappearance of the palm forests, the carbon dating revealing when the last trees fell, the archaeological evidence documenting the collapse. They'll debate the exact mechanisms and timeline, argue about whether the people could have done anything differently. Use Rapa Nui as a metaphor for Earth itself, an isolated system with finite resources, where degradation of the environment threatens the civilization dependent on it. But you don't have the luxury of seeing your life as a case study or metaphor. You're simply trying to survive in a world that has become harder, meaner, more desperate than anything your ancestors. Imagine when they first landed on this island shores. You eat your sweet potatoes and your chicken. You participate in the Birdman ritual. You tell stories to your children about the old days even, though those days were before your own birth. You live in the ruins of a fallen civilization, and you endure because that's what humans do. We endure, we adapt, we create new meanings when old ones fail. We continue even when continuation seems pointless. The moai lie in the dirt, their faces pushed into the soil, their backs exposed to the relentless sun and rain. They'll lie there for centuries, slowly being buried, slowly being forgotten, until strangers from unimaginably distant lands arrive in ships beyond your power to build, and they'll stand amazed at what your ancestors created and destroyed. But that's the distant future. For now, you live in the aftermath, in the ruins in the new world created by the old world's collapse. It is Easter Sunday, April 5th, 1722, and something impossible is happening. 3 enormous structures appear on the horizon, floating islands with white wings, moving against the wind in ways no boat you've ever seen could move. These are ships, Dutch ships commanded by Jacob, Ragaveen, and they represent the first contact between Rapa Nui and the outside world in perhaps 1,000 years. The outside world that your ancestors left behind, that exists only in fading legends and half-remembered stories, has found you. The arrival of Ragaveen's expedition is momentous, though you cannot know yet just how catastrophic contact with the outside world will prove. The Dutch spend only a day on the island. Ragaveen estimates the population at perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 people. He and his men are puzzled by the moai. They don't understand how people, without metal tools, without wheels, without draft animals, could have created and moved such massive statues. The islanders they meet seem poor, living in basic conditions. But they also observe some moai still standing with their pukao in place, suggesting that the complete collapse of moai culture is recent or perhaps still ongoing. The Dutch also document something darker. They shoot and kill several islanders during unclear circumstances, possibly in response to theft, possibly from misunderstanding. It's the first violence between islanders and outsiders, but it won't be the last. The Dutch leave, taking with them observations that will intrigue European scholars but making no attempt to settle or claim the island. They name it Easter Island after the day of their arrival, giving it the name by which the outside world will know it, though to you it remains Rapa Nui Te Pito Tenua. Over the next several decades, other ships occasionally visit. A Spanish expedition in 1770 spends several days on the island, claiming it for Spain, though doing nothing to enforce that claim. Captain James Cook arrives in 1774 during his second Pacific voyage and spends 4 days on the island. Cook's account is particularly valuable because he's a careful observer, and his expedition includes artists who sketch the island and its people. Cook notes that many moai have been toppled, evidence of the social collapse. He describes a population that seems reduced and living in difficult circumstances. Cook's expedition introduces something that will prove far more devastating than any violence: disease. The islanders have been isolated for a millennium, and their immune systems have no experience with Eurasian diseases. When Cook's sailors interact with the islanders, they likely leave behind pathogens, perhaps tuberculosis, perhaps venereal diseases, perhaps other infections. These diseases will smolder in the population, spreading slowly, killing steadily, beginning the biological catastrophe that contact inevitably brings to isolated populations. But the worst is yet to come. In the 19th century, contact becomes more frequent and more destructive. Whalers and other ships begin stopping at Rapa Nui for water and provisions. The interactions are often exploitative. Islanders are sometimes kidnapped to serve as crew on ships. Others are recruited or coerced into labor on South American plantations or guano islands. The population, already reduced by the collapse, begins to decline further. The catastrophe peaks in December 1862, when Peruvian slave raiders arrive. Over several raids, they capture about 1,500 islanders, perhaps half the island's population, and transport them to Peru to work in horrific conditions in the guano industry and on plantations. This isn't just population loss. It's cultural genocide. The raiders specifically target high status individuals, anyone who looks like a leader, anyone who appears educated or important. The Ariki Mo, the paramount chief, is taken. The priests, The keepers of oral tradition and sacred knowledge are taken. The individuals who knew the Rongorongo script, who remembered the old stories, who maintained the cultural memory of the people they're captured and shipped away. The conditions in Peru are nightmarish. Disease, overwork, and abuse kill most of the captives within a year or two. International pressure eventually forces Peru to repatriate the survivors, but by then only about 15 people remain alive. These survivors are put on a ship back to Rapa Nui, but they bring with them smallpox and other diseases. When they arrive, they infect the remaining population. Epidemics sweep the island. People die in their homes, in the fields, faster than the living can bury the dead. By 1877, the population of Rapa Nui has been reduced to just 111 people. Think about that. From perhaps 15,000 at the height of moai culture, reduced to a few thousand after the collapse, and now reduced to barely 100 souls. The cultural loss is staggering. The last people who could rongorongo are dead. The oral traditions that connected the people to their ancestors have been broken. There's no one left who remembers the old stories in their entirety. No one who knows the genealogies. No one who can recite the sacred chants properly. And entire civilizations accumulated. Knowledge has been largely erased in a matter of decades. Those who survive face a new form of colonization. French Catholic missionaries arrive and convert the population to Christianity, though the conversion is overlaid on surviving indigenous beliefs, creating a syncretic religion. In 1888, Chile formally annexes Easter Island, asserting sovereignty over this remote outpost. The remaining Rapa Nui people become Chilean citizens, though they're treated more as subjects than as equals. The island is leased to a Scottish sheep ranching company, and the indigenous population is confined to a small area around the village of Hanga. Roa, while thousands of sheep graze across the rest of the island. The Rapa Nui people are effectively prisoners on their own island, denied access to most of their ancestral land, dependent on the company and the Chilean government for survival. This internal exile will last for decades into the 20th century. Yet, through all of this catastrophe, environmental collapse, civil war, slave raids, disease epidemics, colonization, cultural genocide, the Rapa Nui people survive. The 111 people of 1877 become ancestors of all future Rapa Nui. They maintain their language, though it's influenced by Tahitian and Spanish. They preserve fragments of the old culture, adapting them to new circumstances. They remember, even when much has been forgotten, that they are the people of this island, descendants of the great navigators who first found this speck of land in the vast Pacific. The moai, meanwhile, lie where they fell. Some are completely buried by accumulated soil. Others are partially visible, their stone faces emerging from the earth like swimmers coming up for air. A few still stand. Either they were never toppled or they've been re-erected. The quarry at Ranoroku is frozen in time. Hundreds of statues in various stages of completion. Tools scattered where they were dropped. The whole site a monument to interrupted labor, to ambitions that could never be realized, to outsiders who visit in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Easter Island is a mystery. How did such a primitive people, as they condescendingly see them, create such impressive monuments? Wild theories proliferate. The moai were built by ancient Egyptians, by lost civilizations from Atlantis, or Mu by extraterrestrials. The racist assumption underlying these theories is that Polynesian people couldn't possibly have achieved such feats of engineering and artistry on their own. Thor Heyerdahl, a Norwegian adventurer and amateur anthropologist, arrives in the 1950s with theories about South American origins of Polynesian peoples. He conducts experiments showing that moai can be moved and erected using simple technologies, ropes, wooden levers, stone ramps. He demonstrates what the Rapa Nui people could have told him all along, that their ancestors were perfectly capable of creating the moai using their own knowledge and ingenuity. Heyerdahl's work, for all its flaws, helps restore recognition of Rapa Nui achievement. Slowly, proper archaeology begins. Careful excavation and analysis reveal the timeline of settlement, the development of moai culture, the evidence of environmental degradation, the signs of collapse. Pollen cores from the crater lakes show when the palm forests disappeared. Carbon dating establishes chronologies. The scattered evidence begins to coalesce into a coherent story of rise, peak, and catastrophic decline. The moai themselves begin to be restored. In the 1960s and 1970s, archaeologists and engineers worked to re-erect fallen statues, to restore ahu platforms, to conserve the carvings at Ranuraraku. The island slowly transforms from a landscape of ruins into something like an open-air museum. The moai stand again, though now as monuments to a vanished culture rather than as living religious objects. They face inland as they always did, but they no longer watch over living communities that honor them. They watch over tourist groups, over archaeologists, over a very different world than the one they were created for. In 1995, Easter Island is designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognized as containing cultural treasures of universal human significance. The moai become icons appearing in documentaries, textbooks, popular culture. They symbolize mystery, ancient achievement, and increasingly, they serve as warnings about environmental degradation and societal collapse. The story of Rapa Nui becomes a parable. This is what happens when a society consumes its resources without thought for the future. When competitive display takes precedence over sustainability. When warning signs are ignored until it's too late. The Rapa Nui people themselves experience a renaissance in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The population grows to several thousand, combining indigenous Rapa Nui with Chilean settlers and people of mixed heritage. In the 1960s, they win Chilean citizenship rights. In 2007, the island gained special territory status with greater autonomy. The Rapa Nui language, which nearly died out, is being revived and taught to new generations. Traditional arts, so carving, tattoo, dance are being practiced and preserved. Tourism brings both benefits and challenges. The island receives tens of thousands of visitors annually, bringing economic opportunities, but also putting pressure on the fragile environment. Archaeological sites. The moai are damaged by tourists climbing on them, by erosion accelerated by foot traffic, by the sheer volume of visitation. Preservation becomes an ongoing challenge. How do you protect these monuments while also sharing them with the world? The relationship between the Rapa Nui people and the Chilean government remains complex. There are ongoing disputes over land rights, over autonomy, over who controls the island's resources and future. Some Rapa Nui activists advocate for independence, or at least greater self-governance. Others accept Chilean sovereignty while pushing for indigenous rights and cultural preservation. The political situation is still evolving, still contested. Today, if you visit Easter Island, you'll see a complex landscape of past and present. The moai stand on restored ahu, impressive but silent. The quarry at Ranuraraku remains littered with unfinished statues. The village of Hangaroa has modern buildings, internet cafes, hotels, rental car agencies, all the infrastructure of 21st century tourism. But you'll also see Rapa Nui culture alive, dance performances, traditional crafts, the language being spoken, festivals celebrating indigenous identity. The story of Easter Island is often told as tragedy, environmental catastrophe, societal collapse, cultural destruction, and those elements are certainly present. But it's also a story of resilience, of survival against overwhelming odds, of cultural persistence despite repeated catastrophes. The Rapa Nui people endured the collapse of their classical civilization, endured contact diseases that killed 90% of the population, endured slavery and colonization and decades of oppression. And they're still here, still maintaining their identity, still connected to this island and to the ancestors who carved the moai. The moai themselves endure as well. They've survived the collapse, survived toppling, survived centuries exposed to the elements, survived being buried and excavated, survived the attention of millions of visitors. They stand as testament to human creativity and ambition, to what people can achieve when they commit enormous resources and labor to a vision. They also stand as warning of what can happen when that vision becomes disconnected from ecological reality, when cultural values lead to unsustainable practices. Standing before a moai today, looking up at its stern face and massive bulk, you're connecting across centuries to the people who carved it, who moved it, who erected it, who honored it. The specific religious beliefs that animated these statues are largely lost, but the human impulses they represent, the desire to honor ancestors, to create beauty, to leave something lasting, to connect with the divine, these are universal and timeless. The moai speak to us still, though in a language transformed by time and catastrophe, telling stories of achievement and hubris, of resilience and loss, of the grandeur and fragility of human civilization. It's the present day, and you stand in the quarry at Rano Raraku, surrounded by nearly 400 moai in various stages of completion. Some are barely roughed out, just suggestions of faces emerging from the volcanic rock. Others are complete in every detail, but still attached to the bedrock, awaiting a release that will never come. Still others lie on the slopes, abandoned during transport, their journey interrupted by the collapse of the civilization that created them. The silence is profound, broken only by wind and birdsong. These statues have stood here for centuries, frozen in time, waiting for workers who will never return. What do the moai mean? The question has obsessed researchers, visitors, and storytellers since Europeans first encountered these massive stone faces. The answer is layered, complex, evolving as new evidence emerges and as perspectives shift. At the most basic level, we now know that moai were representations of ancestors, created to honor deceased chiefs and to channel their mana, their spiritual power for the benefit of the living. They were placed on ahu platforms that also served as burial sites, creating sacred complexes where the living communed with the dead, where offerings were made, where the boundary between worlds grew thin. But the moai were also political statements, displays of power and prestige in the competitive world of Rapa Nui's clans. A large, impressive moai demonstrated that a clan had the resources to feed workers, the timber to transport massive statues, the organizational capacity to coordinate complex projects. The moai were advertisements of success, of divine favor, of the clan's importance in the island's hierarchy, the competitive escalation. Each clan trying to build bigger. Statues and rivals was part of this. Political dynamic. The moai were also artistic achievements of the highest order. Look closely at their faces and you'll see they're not identical but individual, each with subtle differences in features, proportions, expression. The carvers were artists, not just laborers, and they brought creativity and skill to their work. The smooth surfaces, the crisp lines, the powerful presence of these statues, all of this represents conscious aesthetic choices, traditions of carving passed down and refined over generations. The engineering required to create and move the moai was sophisticated. Recent experimental archaeology has demonstrated that the walking method tilting, the statue upright and rocking it forward using ropes is both possible and efficient. Computer modeling shows that teams of 101-5 people could move even large moai using this technique, far fewer workers than earlier theories suggested. The knowledge required to carve statues that wouldn't crack, to judge angles and weight distribution, to move multi-ton objects across rough terrain, this was accumulated. Technological knowledge, refined through trial and error, passed from master carvers to apprentices. The engineering required to create and move the moai was sophisticated. Recent experimental archaeology has demonstrated that the walking method tilting, the statue upright and rocking it forward using ropes is both possible and efficient. Computer modeling shows that teams of 101-5 people could move even large moai using this technique, far fewer workers than earlier theories suggested. The knowledge required to carve statues that wouldn't crack, to judge angles and weight distribution, to move multi-ton objects across rough terrain, this was accumulated. Technological knowledge, refined through trial and error, passed from master carvers to apprentices. But the moai also represents something darker, a society trapped by its own beliefs and status systems into unsustainable practices. The resources poured into moai construction could have been directed toward sustainable agriculture, toward forest management, toward practices that would have preserved the island's environment. But the cultural imperative to honor ancestors through statue building, combined with competitive pressure between clans, locked the society into an escalating cycle of monument construction that contributed to environmental collapse. This makes Easter Island a parable for modern civilization. We look at the Rapa Nui people and wonder, how could they not see what was happening? How could they cut down the last tree? How could they continue building moai even as their environment degraded? But we're doing the same thing, just at a larger scale. We're degrading Earth's environment, deforestation, soil erosion, biodiversity loss, climate change while pouring resources into status symbols and competitive displays. We see the warning signs but struggle to change course because our economic and cultural systems, like Rapa Nui's moai religion, are deeply embedded and resistant to fundamental change. Yet the parable has another dimension: survival and resilience. The Rapa Nui people endured catastrophic collapse and devastating contact with the outside world, but they survived. Their culture transformed but persisted. Today, Rapa Nui culture is experiencing a renaissance. Young people are learning the language, practicing traditional arts, connecting with their heritage. The population has recovered and continues to grow. The story is not just about collapse, but about human resilience. Our ability to endure and adapt and preserve identity, even through catastrophe. The moai themselves have become global icons. Their image is instantly recognizable, appearing in everything from museum exhibitions to emoji. They represent mystery, ancient achievement, the power of human creativity. But they also increasingly represent ecological warning, the consequences of unsustainable practices. Depending on how you look at them, the moai are either humanity's greatest achievement or most visible failure. And perhaps they're both simultaneously. Modern preservation efforts face complex challenges. The statues are weathering, degraded by centuries of exposure, by lichen and moss growth, by chemical and biological processes breaking down the volcanic tuff. Tourism, while economically essential for the island, accelerates deterioration through foot traffic and occasional vandalism. Climate change brings new threats. Rising sea levels endanger coastal ahu. Changed precipitation patterns affect erosion rates. Preserving the moai for future generations requires constant vigilance and significant resources. There are also ethical questions about restoration. When archaeologists re-erect fallen moai, are they preserving the monuments or creating inauthentic reconstructions? The standing moai you see today weren't continuously standing. Most were toppled in the collapse and re-erected in the 20th century. They look as they might have looked in 1500, but that appearance is partially a modern creation. Is this historical preservation or historical fiction? The debate continues among preservation specialists. The relationship between the Rapa Nui people and their moai has also evolved. For the ancestors who carved them, moai were living religious objects, embodiments of sacred power. For the people who toppled them, they represented a failed system, perhaps a target for rage and despair. For Rapa Nui people today, the moai are cultural heritage, symbols of ancestral achievement, sources of pride and identity. They're also economic assets tourism centered on the moai provides, livelihoods for many islanders. The moai mean different things now than they did to the carvers, and their meaning continues to evolve. Scientific study continues to reveal new insights. Laser scanning creates detailed 3D models of every moai, preserving their exact dimensions, digitally even as the physical statues deteriorate. Chemical analysis of volcanic tuff traces statues to specific quarry locations. Study of tool marks reveals carving techniques. Excavation of Ahu platforms uncovers burial practices and offerings. Each discovery adds detail to our understanding of moai culture. One recent discovery has been particularly striking. Many moai were much larger than visible. When fallen moai are excavated, they prove to have bodies extending several feet below the surface. The famous Easter Island heads actually have bodies, buried by centuries of accumulated soil. This discovery changes how we see them, making them even more impressive than previously thought. A head that's 10 feet tall might be attached to a body that makes the total height 20 feet or more. The quarry at Rano Raraku tells perhaps the most poignant story. Here are the statues that were never completed, abandoned at various stages when moai culture ended. One enormous statue, if finished, would have been over 70 feet tall and weighed close to 270 tons, a colossus. That could never actually have been moved with the technology available. Was this an act of hubris? A clan attempting something impossible to prove their superiority? Or was it an experiment, an attempt to push the boundaries of what was achievable? We'll never know the carver's intentions. But the unfinished giant remains a monument to ambition that exceeded capacity. Looking at the moai today, we see them through multiple lenses simultaneously. They're archaeological artifacts providing evidence about past societies. They're works of art appreciated for their aesthetic power. They're cultural symbols representing Rapa Nui identity and heritage. They're tourist attractions, economic resources for the island. They're environmental warnings, cautionary tales about sustainability. They're mysteries, still not fully understood despite decades of study. Perhaps most importantly, the moai are mirrors. What we see in them reflects our own concerns, values, and fears. In the 19th century, Europeans saw primitive savagery and mysterious lost civilizations. In the mid-20th century, adventurers like Thor Heyerdahl saw puzzles to be solved through daring experiments. In the late 20th century, environmentalists saw warnings about ecological collapse. In the 21st century, we see all of these things and more, filtered through contemporary concerns about climate change, cultural preservation, indigenous rights, and sustainable development. The Rapa Nui people themselves have complex relationships with the moai. For some, they're sources of pride, connections to ancestors, symbols of what Rapa Nui culture achieved. For others, they're complicated, reminders of a past that includes not just achievement, but also catastrophe, collapse, and near extinction. For younger generations reconnecting with indigenous identity, the moai are focal points for cultural revival, inspiration for contemporary art and expression. As you stand in the quarry or before a restored ahu, as you look into the stern face of a moai, you're connecting across time to people not so different from yourself. They had hopes and fears, created art and beauty, made mistakes with tragic consequences, endured unimaginable hardships, and survived. The moai stand as testament to all of this, to human creativity and human folly, to what we can achieve and what we can destroy, to the grandeur and fragility of civilization. The story of Easter Island and the moai isn't finished. The Rapa Nui people continue to write new chapters. Preservation efforts continue. Research reveals new insights. The meaning of the moai continues to evolve as each generation interprets them through contemporary concerns and values. The statues themselves endure, battered by time and weather, but still standing, still commanding attention, still inspiring awe and questions. What will future generations see when they look at the moai? What will they learn from the story of Rapa Nui? Perhaps they'll have solved the remaining mysteries, deciphered Rongorongo, understood exactly how moai were moved, reconstructed the complete timeline of settlement and collapse. Perhaps they'll have found ways to preserve the statues against continued deterioration. Perhaps Rapa Nui culture will have continued to flourish, creating new traditions while honoring old ones. Or perhaps they'll see in the moai what we see now, reflections of themselves, their own concerns and achievements projected onto these ancient stones. Perhaps the moai will continue to be mirrors, showing each generation of humanity something about itself, our capacity for creation and destruction, our genius and our foolishness, our ability to endure through catastrophe. The moai have stood for centuries. They'll likely stand for centuries more, silent witnesses to the flow of time, monuments to ancestors long dust, reminders that civilizations rise and fall, but that human creativity, resilience, and the search for meaning endure. These stone giants, born from volcanic rock and human ambition, remain to tell their story, or rather, to let us tell our own stories through them, seeing in their stern faces whatever truths we need to find.